Welcome to The Green Urbanist, the podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Hello, welcome back to another episode. If you're new to the podcast, The Green Urbanist podcast is all about the climate and biodiversity crises in cities and how built environment practitioners can respond to that. We talk about a wide range of topics from architecture to ecology and economics and everything in between. Today I'm delighted to be joined in conversation by Kent Jackson and James Woodall of SOM.
My name is Kent Jackson. I'm a design partner here in our European headquarters in London, and look over generally all of the projects that are coming through our doors in the European context.
I'm James Woodall. I'm a sustainability lead here at SOM. My remit is part of a broader initiative called the Sustainable Engineering Studio here at SOM, and I get complete oversight of every single project here in London and within our remit here in the London office in terms of making sure there's consistent output and sustainability.
If you're not familiar with SOM, which is Skidmore Owings and Merrill, you're definitely familiar with their work because they've been around for about 80 years, the architecture, engineering and master planning practice, and they've designed some of the most iconic buildings in the world, really. So do just have a look at their website if you want to familiarize yourself more with their work, but a huge pedigree of a lot of innovation and a lot of really pushing the boundary in terms of sustainable design in a sort of large global mainstream architecture and engineering practice. They have one of the most ambitious net zero carbon targets in the industry, I believe, which is for all of their work globally to be net zero carbon, whole life net zero carbon by the year 2040, which is a pretty huge undertaking. And so I wanted to get together with them and talk about how they're going to do that, what sort of journey they're on, and how they're more widely trying to influence the industry and sort of innovation and research they're doing to make that a reality. We also talk about their ambition to go beyond just net zero carbon towards things like zero waste, zero water, and regenerative design, where they would be sequestering carbon in structures, for instance. And we talk about a wide range of different project types, from what Ken says the most difficult sort of building, which is tall buildings, skyscrapers, through to things like master plans and university campuses, and the way that these offer different challenges and opportunities for sustainable design. You can check out some images of the projects we talk about at the companion blog post to this episode, which is at greenurbanist.substack.com. A link to that is in the episode description. Fantastic. Well, it's really good to have you both. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast was that SOM have quite a ambitious target, I think one of the most ambitious I've seen in the industry, which is that for all of your active work to be whole life net zero carbon by 2040. And we want to talk about sort of the journey that you're on, I suppose, of getting there. How are you going to do it? That's basically the question. And feel free to start that wherever.
Well, I guess in a broad sense, we feel we're in this right space to be doing this and finding ways, I think, within the industry to give leadership where it has been an approach that has been sometimes picked up but easily dropped when we kind of meet these very big challenges. And, you know, we find ourselves in an industry that's had it too good for too long. And I think it's coming back to a lot of base principles that actually shouldn't be that hard, but I think a lot of the industry is finding it very difficult. So we have put ourselves a task of not really, the industry needs to get their house in order, but we've also tried to get our house in order. We have become a net zero carbon business to do that, and we've also created a series of detailed ways in which we can monitor, as James was mentioning in his introduction, of being able to oversee all the projects coming from the London office. One, key leaders, but also we have a metric system that we can now look at any building at any time of the project in any office to understand where it sits within operational and embodied energy and its whole life cycle quest. I want to kind of really set also that we certainly don't have all the answers, but the reason why we're here and the reason why we're in this space is because we want to open up dialogue where we think it's been far too closed off, and really open arms to anyone that's got good solutions, and also to look beyond just our construction industry today, but look and do leapfrogging ways of getting to where we need to be from a sustainable point of view. I suppose James could kind of take that idea and probably go into a little bit more of the detail of how we're doing that as a practice, from I think our carbon loop initiatives to our whole life carbon accounting.
I mean, the one thing I'd add about the nature and the ambition of the target you mentioned at the beginning, Ross, I think it's worth drawing on because it is ambitious, and we wanted to make that tone of ambition, that statement of ambition, but it's not blind ambition, I think, is the one key thing to point out. And Kent made the point about having all the infrastructure in place to do that, and I think we're, I guess, not comfortable but reassured because of having those mechanisms in place that will help support this, and they will act as almost like a foundation to delivering net zero carbon. But equally, we see a lot in the industry of people making these targets without that infrastructure in place. And so this whole notion of getting your house in order, we think, is absolutely critical, really, to putting you on that right path. And so I think another thing to point out, just a reflection on what Kent had said, really, is to make the statement is also critical, because it does open your arms somewhat to typical conversations that could come your way. If you don't make these types of gestures to the industry and say that we want to achieve these types of things, the conversations can't come to us, or they may not be as readily coming to us as they might otherwise be. So I think that's the one key thing to point out there. So in terms of how we're getting there and what things we're putting into place, Kent mentioned the fact that I'm here and that there's a group of us, across SOM that are effectively trying to mandate sustainable design across all of our projects and reaching that, but also supporting teams with it. So we're not doing every single project sustainable design. We're equipping designers with the right skills to kind of carry out those elements themselves, and then we're reinforcing that with tailored analysis, etc. Now, the carbon loop is what Kent alluded to, the ability for us to foresee on any single point in time how every project's performing. That's critical, right? Because if we see that one project is starting to go behind the curve, for example, it's a bit of a wake-up call for us to then say, what's happening with this project? Why isn't it getting as far as we wanted to? And you can review it on a stage-by-stage basis, but you could do it on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, etc. And it's really, really helping us to kind of keep that cross-section, if you like, across the projects and see how everything is doing at any point in time. So there's that, and then there's the sort of continual reviews that we have in the practice across, sustainable design. So we'll call projects in effectively to kind of have those conversations and help them along in that journey. And then there's the tools, the hard side of it, the equipping of staff to enable them to have these types of conversations more adequately, right? Because I think that sustainable design is both well known, but it's also quite scary as a prospect as well to a lot of designers, even nowadays, right? Everyone knows the fundamentals and the principles, but how do you put them into action? And so one of our roles is actually to create tools that people can use readily, that don't require weeks of learning in order to get there, but it enables them to answer very kind of detailed questions very easily, and it almost puts them on that path, almost a springboard, if you like, to then have those meaningful conversations with clients and with collaborators more. So just a bit of an insight really as to how we're getting there.
I think that culture of practice element sounds really essential. I've heard that from other architects as well, working of saying that, broadly, technically, we know how to do it, but it's that thing of actually making it a default and making sure people have the knowledge and the support to actually make it happen, day to day.
Yeah, I think that a lot of it stems from the top in terms of the ability to say over and over again, we want to do this. And I think that comes from Kent and the rest of the partners about saying, these are our objectives. We're steadfast in the commitment to achieve those. And that gives us the empowerment in terms of the ability to kind of have those conversations more confidently, if you like. So
when we were walking around, you gave me a tour of the office just now, which was great, and showed me a lot of your projects, from the sort of 1960s up to present. And I think what was really clear from what you were saying was this culture of, I suppose, exploration and pushing at the edge of what is possible in the time, and also, attempts to use, less structure and less embodied carbon and that kind of thing, and how that's been evolving over time. So I think it's fair to say that you sort of, you've got a long pedigree in this, and I wonder, would it be helpful for people to sort of maybe use if you could tell us about a couple of your projects, a couple of case studies of where you've been able to deliver those like very, very high sustainability standards, and then what that might mean in terms of going forward.
Sure, and I might just take a step back to that a little bit in case people are less aware. But we were, when we first were founded 80 plus years ago, we were brought a series of engineers and architects together of Skidmore Owings and Merrill. And we are just a series of, I think, what I would say is more like-minded designers that are looking to solve problems. And I think that's an issue we face today, is where we have historically kind of worked in similar ways, and I'm talking more about the industry, and the same people around the table. And I think what we are really wanting to do is keep that idea of just how could we get like-mindedness together, and it's kind of to a conversation earlier of, sustainability for far too long has been kind of the itchy wool jumper to a lot of people rather than the oxygen that we breathe. And so we have been trying to change our mindset as well as others in this quest to really do that. And I think that people like James and other experts that we've got around the practice is something we want to continue to grow and nurture and be able to kind of change, I think, this issue around innovation, where we've kind of built the same for quite a long period of time without dramatic change. And I think there's a couple things. Just we do have a legacy of innovation, and the projects that we would have walked you past wouldn't have probably been built if there wasn't some degree of this idea of where architecture and engineering comes together in very sophisticated and ultimately a very elegant way. But I think through that process, it's where we actually can critique each other at different levels of how a building wants to function in practice. And I would say that we have been thinking about sustainability, but never maybe championing it as loudly as we are now. But it's always been built within the firm of how we actually can make buildings better with less embodied energy. And I think that becomes that strong engineering and architectural balance that we have within our projects. And so we looked at the John Hancock Tower, which was the first mixed-use tower, but again, was significantly less carbon than when we actually looked at two buildings sitting side by side, which is what the client originally came to us to talk about. So by putting one on top of the other and then coming up with a structure that was very innovative of its day, completely changed the way in which we think about buildings and tall buildings, certainly. And that has, I think, always been this idea of challenging each other. So we've looked at a series of projects, and I think we also walked past a couple of our proud achievements of our 25-year award that we've got from the American Institute of Architects. And the Hajj Terminal came to mind that we did in Jeddah, which is, one of the first of its kind and never been repeated, with this open-air airport, which is dealing with both the environmental aspects as well as the cultural aspects of that region, and something we're very proud of as a series of projects that we've been looking at. But what we find, I'm just going to get to this point about innovation. I think, when we first were a practice in the 40s and 50s, we were seeing maybe the benefits of the Industrial Revolution and seeing new materials and new systems come into it. And probably in that process, through air conditioning, through glazing and single pane glass, we were able to kind of move away from working with the environment and being able to kind of do things that we never really had question about. There was endless materials, endless resources to be able to do these types of buildings. And what we see now is everybody's aware of that fact that we can't just keep using our resources the way we have. But what stopped for me is the innovation coming into our industry to see where that change is going to come from. The construction industry suffers that very little innovation, like 3% or something of the industry, actually comes to innovation. And we've had to take a series of projects to come forward on that, and kind of on our own time and resources to think about this. So we brought a project forward that you might have seen called Urban Sequoia. And this was really kind of asking the question, could we think about tall buildings in a different way? We looked at different types of prototypes, but really, could we get to kind of a regenerative or carbon negative solution for a building? And so we looked at the tall building and kind of asked ourselves, could it perform like a tree does and actually do more good for the environment and kind of be able to restore the environment to some ways, rather than just continuing to consume carbon, like all of the buildings that we're in, the one we're in today, the one we're looking across the street, all of these buildings that have worked in the wrong way. And we did this not because we had a client that could fund it for us, but we did it in a way is because of this always working in similar ways that we always have, and not being able to bring innovation into projects because of risk. And I think innovation and risk are, unfortunately, these two things that have a hard time ever detangling from each other. So Urban Sequoia was really this idea of how we build buildings today, which are really additive and adding more materials than we need to, and really looking at how we could streamline systems and actually do a reductive design and kind of remove materials from buildings and reduce ultimately the amount of embodied energy by also then making zero operational energy as well within projects. And, we did this, we also put a couple of parameters because, you can always say you can do something, but then is it achievable? And I think we also said we are only going to use things that are already out, that are already available to us. They may not be in our industry, but they're around in other industries for us to actually harness and leverage. And so we were also challenging ourselves to look outside and not just build in the way in which we always have. So that's a really important project for us. And we did it really because then when we sit at the table with a client, we can actually bring new ideas to the table and push ideas forward. Because otherwise, when you kind of come around the table, you generally fall back on things that you've done before. And I think we realize and recognize that has to stop. We have to work in a completely different way than we have historically.
Yeah, just to add a few points, I guess. I mean, Urban Sequoia is fascinating to me because it really hammers home this notion of the ability to do more with less. And so building on the analogy, what if a building were a tree? What happens if a collection of buildings were conceived as a forest as well? And that ability to think about this notion of Urban Sequoia being scalable is quite fascinating, and it really beds home that notion of what could regenerative design look like. New buildings aren't going away anytime soon, and whilst retrofit is, something that everyone wants to endorse and advocate for much more strongly, there will still be a need for new buildings. And so I think we were really keen to have that conversation and say, well, what does regenerative design look like? It's talked about so much, right, regenerative design, but it's often kind of pushed to the periphery, if you like, and everything is a bit novel in terms of or nuanced, you could say, around what regenerative design looks like. And we really wanted to bring that back into I guess you could say the mainstream, but an ability to see regenerative design in form through the lens of a new building was really captivating to us, and it's bringing things to light that now we can bring into everyday conversations that we're having right now. So Urban Sequoia as an overall concept is fascinating, but equally we can break it down into different factors. The reductive design approach is just one method really that we're trying to embed into lots of different projects we're working on right now. It's just it's a change in mentality. I think that's fundamentally what's at work here. We bring in new technology that can naturally aid that innovation, but equally some of the most innovative things are just in front of us, and it's a new way of working. And so it's bringing out those types of things and making sure we can do it more frequently in the future. It's a really valuable precedent for us because we took it as far as we actually did. More often than not, it's just a thought in someone's head. The ability to show clients this type of material and show what the potential is of these types of things, I think, is what enabled us to change.
Yeah, so it makes that concept of regenerative design more tangible.
Absolutely, yeah. Tangible is a perfect word, yeah. Can
you tell us a bit more about the details of that Urban Sequoia project? What's the sort of look and feel like? And
yeah, I mean, what we can do after is give you, I don't know whether we can do it in the notes, just give you a few links to describe
definitely.
the project so that it comes to life, right? I think through a podcast we can only tell the story a little bit. But I mean, Urban Sequoia, we talked about reductive design. I think it's formed of the notion that it is effectively a mixed-use tower, something that could ultimately be conceived as an office or residential or another form, because what we see is a lot of redundancy in the industry right now. So it's effectively a basis through which we can imagine the future of the industry becoming one that is more adaptable. And so there is this really novel innovation around the structural concept that enables that flexibility to take place. So it's not reliant on, there's a grid to it, but equally that grid is flexible and you can break out different areas where you want to as well. So that's one of the fundamental pieces to it. The facade design is also innovative in that there's embedded shading in it, which doesn't prevent the architecture from coming to light, if that makes sense. And there's maybe Kent, you want to elaborate a little bit more?
Well, yeah, I think another fundamental aspect of it is thinking about the typology differently. So we picked the hardest typology we possibly could to do this because tall buildings are difficult. I think if you looked at it, carbon per capita or per person, I think it would come out actually much better. But they're easy buildings to kind of point to and say why. So we wanted to just take maybe one of the most difficult typologies to bring forward. But another aspect when you think about tall buildings, and maybe a lot of people don't really think about this, but it's usually trying to keep the wind out of the building. It can cause different problems for different reasons that I won't go into on this podcast. But we actually reversed that idea and decided if we brought the air through the building and almost treating it like a chimney or a heat stack coming through the building. We could actually have a direct air capture that could be happening, capturing the carbon at the top of the building. And because we had so little mechanical needs for the building, you actually have so much more open space to do that on rooftops, which generally have been considered with mechanical plants and other things. So we were able to kind of direct air capture, which again is available, not in our industry really seeing much of it, but you're seeing everywhere else where there actually are pushing these initiatives. So we wanted to kind of test that technology as well and see what that could do to benefit. And that's one of the major elements to it, to achieve this, and thinking differently about how we always treated this typology. And the idea of having much more flexible and adaptive buildings, as James had said, I think is a really important aspect. So, it could be a hotel, it could be a residence, it could be an office, or it could be a combination of all three of those under one roof, which is some of the issues you're now seeing in our cities that are out in the press, and looking how we can change that, but still allow for our cities to grow. And I think adaptive reuse is wonderful, and we have quite a few that we're currently working on and building in Europe. But also we know in areas that aren't Europe are going to be cities that are growing at such a fast rate. The thing that we need to do is give them ideas and concepts that they can actually take forward that can be far more sustainable than when you can't build with materials around you that are going to be low carbon or no carbon type solutions.
So the direct air capture element, is that the kind of thing you would see on like an oil and gas refinery that they use in place there, almost moved to an architectural context?
Not in as many words. It's effectively a big fan that helps to effectively consume and capture carbon in the air, right? And then it's a storage device, but it looks like an air handling unit in effect. And I think one of the things we're quite keen is to think about the ways in which you could integrate that within architecture. Since we did Urban Sequoia, I've seen products come to market, I think they were in North America, whereby they actually combine carbon capture with air handling units. And it's one of those modes of thinking about, well, what are we already doing? And what's out there, and how can you combine these things together? That combination of direct air capture and air handling units is a perfect one, because we have it everywhere, right? So what happens if you think incrementally about if that were retrofitted onto every air handling unit in the London office core, for example? There's a fascinating potential about what could be possible. But equally, is it possible? What barriers are preventing that from coming to light? And it's one of probably ownership and regulation and various other factors in there as well. But it's effectively saying, there are innovative things out there right now in front of us. What's preventing that from happening? And Urban Sequoia was one way of saying, we see potential in this. Let's have the conversation. Let's advance this a bit further.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So it's technically possible.
Yeah,
it's just a matter of actually bringing it to life.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you've got this concept now you can bring to clients. Have you seen it come into projects?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And, that ultimately, I guess, is the end of the day, why do you take on a project like that?
Yeah,
and so it's clearly to learn something from, but ultimately, can it then be scaled, or can it be brought into projects? And so, there's some really interesting projects that we've been looking at, and one that we've recently won, which is the New York Climate Exchange at Governor's Island. And again, that is a building that's pound for pound really trying to bring this campus to be the first of its kind. It's an international center that will develop solutions around climate crisis. And its design and its master plan embodied this mission, targeting net zero energy, water, and waste. It is also on a geothermal network for heating and cooling, and there's energy share between buildings, as well as a lot of energy being captured on site as well, and this large expansive roof that it has, and a timber structure, and I think also at passive house credentials as well. So it's really pound for pound, really working hard. And was it a direct reflection of what we worked on in Urban Sequoia, that it was tall typology and this is very long horizontal? Yeah. Maybe not exactly, but I think it brings the same experts to the project and being able to enlighten us to see through. I mean, we've been looking at timber projects for 20 plus years at scale, so looking at 40-story timber towers and actually making those open source for anyone to actually borrow or to try to see if they can build. And we just don't find that happening at a pace that we would have liked by now. And there's many different issues around this innovation and risk, which I think is one of these issues that we see in the industry. But yeah, so that's kind of a direct reflection, I guess, of maybe did that client bring us into that project because they saw urban sequoia, or was it that we were able to solve those problems that they brought forward in the proposal because of the knowledge that we had for urban sequoia? I think it's just a general education that we're trying to bring to ourselves so that we can enlighten projects.
But equally, urban sequoia is split into different parts, right? There's multiple innovations happening within one core central concept, and what we've been trying to do with the knowledge that if urban sequoia was the pinnacle of what we're able to achieve, but not ultimately viable for now, we have to create the belief in the system that it can be. And so we actually see a lot of merit in being able to kind of have these threads of conversation that we want to pursue separately that may ultimately fuse together and become urban sequoia as we know it, right? So we're having conversations with developers and starting to test these ideas, and around timber being obviously the most relevant one here, but the structural concept being something that no one's ever seen before. Is it viable right now? Let's explore it. Can we do it in isolation on a particular smaller intervention, for example? And we're seeing a lot of kind of attraction there with all these different initiatives, and direct air capture is probably one of them as well. And it enables us to have more meaningful conversations with Governor's Island, for example, as one of the clients that we kind of utilize this for, because they're becoming more receptive too, right? We're not pitching this against a blank wall. I think that there is so much interest in the industry around what are the solutions here, and there's a multitude of different solutions here, but effectively we want to be able to say, this is why we went through urban sequoia, because we wanted to challenge the industry. We wanted to create effectively what we thought was the solution here for this particular subset, and say this is something that has a lot of value in it, and clients are demanding of that now. They want to be able to do the right thing. To put it bluntly, they want to do the right thing, and they don't know how to for the most part. So we're there as advocates, we're there as educators, and I think we have to recognise that task that we have of bringing on clients, educating clients as to what are the right solutions here. So
there's a really interesting aspect of this. I think architects and master planners and whatever often feel at the mercy of their clients, which of course we always are to some extent. But I think there's two things you're doing here, which are like accepting your role as a sort of agent of change and a provocateur, in a sense of saying, actually, we know the direction we want to see the industry going, so we're going to be putting out these messages and this work to try and steer it in that direction, rather than feeling, you can't do that because of whatever. And the other thing is, I think, being quite visionary, and instead of thinking we'll just do the exact same thing but more efficient or with less material, thinking, actually, what if a building was totally different to how we've done them before? And I think that is something that's sorely missing, actually, in the industry. So,
yeah, I mean, it's got its challenges. I think this issue of, how many times have you heard, the client didn't want to go for LEED Platinum, or didn't want to take these design initiatives that we put forward? Those are too easy of things to say. It's, saying 30 years ago that my neighbor didn't recycle, so I'm not going to. So I mean, these excuses that we have in the industry they happen, but we can't use those any longer as excuses. We need to kind of actually have ideas that are going to be able to percolate and be able to make change. And some of these ideas, whether I go on record as saying this or not, but I mean, clients don't necessarily need to know. Here, a positive thing I'll say, you could look at this building that we're in today, and there are structural innovations within it. This particular building had a diagrid and needed it because it's actually spanning over the railway tracks, and we couldn't put any columns down. But in actual fact, if you had built a traditional building with not a diagrid but more traditional, you would have been using, let's say, I'm going to use a number, but I probably won't be too far off, maybe 20% more steel for that building. That ultimately is less money for our client to have to spend on structure, but that's a direct reflection that it's less embodied energy in the building. So there are things that you can hand back over to the client that is actually a savings to them. It's not always that it's sustainability is going to cost more. We should actually, and this is the great thing about working in SOM and this interdisciplinary practice, where this idea of synergies between engineering and sustainability that kind of fuse together, where we can actually look at this kind of Venn diagram of influence in a project to be able to kind of throw those ideas forward. So maybe they don't want to go after one element of the operational side of energy, but if we actually could bring that much more embodied energy out of the building, cost the project less money, client's going to move it forward, it doesn't cost more, and for ourselves, we have less embodied energy in the building.
I'm fascinated by this notion that sustainability is perceived to cost more. I generally am, and I think embodied carbon is just one nuance of how we're proving that to be not the case. Because material efficiency at its core is this whole notion of reductive design that we called it earlier. It's reducing the amount of material. Material equates to cost. It is a cost saving in effect, and having the ability to talk to an engineer next to me, they may not like it, but I can just have a conversation with them off the cuff of nothing, and be able to float ideas with them, and it's fascinating the interaction you can get, and it's not common, I would say. So that I really enjoy that. But this notion that sustainable design is kind of myth perception is one of the big things I think in the industry right now about sustainable design being a premium and a bolt-on. You've heard it before, but equally it all reflects back on what a client has come to an architect with. And the one thing I will always say back is the perfect client does not exist. When it comes to sustainability, that's where we have to acknowledge our role as educators and advocates for better. And it's about communication and communicating the value of sustainable design through a lens and a language that they perceive and they understand as a client is critical. We've got to get better at communicating sustainable design, not simply through the lens of just energy consumption or etc., but through cost lenses as well. And one of the things I often talk about is adding shading in. It's one of the most common conversations we have about shade provision. Why do we do it? Because it helps with cooling, right? Why is cooling important? Because it's an energy consumer. But what happens if your client doesn't care about ongoing energy costs because they're selling the building? Then you talk about capital and you talk about plant, the thing that provides the cooling. They're making a saving because the size of that plant is smaller. So it's just about adjusting your argument, creating a tact that communicates to what their key interests are. And I think as an industry, you have to get much better at getting to that point and understanding the nuances of your argument that you're trying to make here, because sustainability can be valuable through the right lens if you have to adjust your lens to suit that.
Yeah. I mean, value engineering was every designer's kryptonite. But it was. But I mean, here's an idea. Here's a novel idea. Let's try to reduce as much material as we have to in a building. That is a direct. I mean, every QS should take that to note when they talk to a designer next, because, that is the reduction of all the embodied energy that's coming into the building. And, we just need to have a different thought process when we go into designing buildings. That we've just had it too easy for too long. Mm-hmm. And again, I think we really need to be starting to sharpen our pencils and look at it, where we're all in this fight to save the planet together. I think the quantity surveyor is. The architect is, the client is, but we just need to think about it in a same focus of planetary health, rather than looking at it isolated of you're just trying to change the design or trying to kind of remove something of value that I find from a design point of view for a building. So again, it's a mindset, and it's a mindset shift that needs to happen very quickly. It should have already have happened, to be quite honest, and we're trying to catch up for lost time.
Yeah. How do you? I want to keep on this topic of architecture for the moment. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about master planning, but you're famous for tall buildings. You've done some of the tallest buildings in the world. How do you manage that tension between tall buildings, the added embodied carbon of tall buildings, and the perception, I think, growing in the industry that actually tall buildings are inherently unsustainable in some ways, against this journey that you're on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's. I notice I always jump into this question first, and James, I know, has been working about this idea of how you kind of can maybe think of things a little bit differently with tall buildings at scale. But I think that's the exact reason we wanted to take that project forward, to see how we can do that. And I think because this issue around carbon is, and sadly, so new to everyone, we haven't really been looking at that in a way of density and carbon, like our cities, and being able to kind of justify that buildings will need to be tall. Yeah. And if they are, we should be looking at population densities and other things to justify our carbon. But instead, we're looking at them in isolated cases and isolated things of typology. It's hospitals are high embodied energy, but I don't think we're going to be removing hospitals from our cities anytime soon. But we just have to really rationalize where are we going to spend carbon, how we can reduce it, and maybe buildings that are going to struggle in being able to do that. But I don't know, James, if you want to kind of maybe take that a little bit further.
I think urban sequoia, just to go back to it briefly, I think that was trying to address the elephant in the room that you raised, and it's like trying to confront it head on and say, tall buildings will exist, right? What happens if we change the way we design them? Because historically, as you said, they've been carbon inefficient, they've been quite poor in terms of their performance. But what happens if we start to change those types of things? And going to timber is just the beginning. I think there are so many things that we need to explore with tall buildings that can be done. And Not to say we want to rid the world of tall buildings. I think they'll always exist, but I think there is a different way that we can do it, and they can be valuable to society. So densification is something we're not going to get away from either. And so if you place tall buildings in the right places, then they can be valuable. Next to transport hubs is what I mean. So thinking about where tall building and where density is useful to a city, I think is part of that big picture thinking that is often kind of unaddressed here. You know, we look at it, tall buildings in a sort of in a microcosm, and look at them and critique them in their, you know, their element, but equally what's surrounding them, and can they be useful if you think about them within a broader urban capacity?
Yeah, and I think that thing of like, what is the within the city and the context of the city in the system's perspective, what is it giving back?
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
a sense, aside from the carbon, and then how do you compare that to something that's more low rise?
Yeah, so are we measuring using the right metrics might be the best way to address that.
And I know you've been looking at the carbon square mile study as well, which is kind of looking at density and carbon, which again, because we're so nascent in this process of how to kind of rationalize or work with carbon, I think that's kind of an interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, the square mile study was one. It's a piece of research similar to Urban Sequoia that we wanted to kind of look at and reflect on a bit more, and look at the characteristics of urban development, and say, you know, what is the most sustainable. I think sustainability is one of those terms that people often say, you know, out loud all the time, but rarely define it. And so what is sustainable design? And they effectively took quadrants in different areas around San Francisco and said, you know, let's look at a typical business part, let's look at the downtown core, let's look at sort of mainly sort of suburban, and then look at the sort of rural package of measures as well. And they looked at transport associated with those different things. They looked at the construction, the embodied carbon associated with the structures there, and they looked at the operational carbon as well, the efficiency or inefficiency of doing those things put together. And it's something that you kind of think already exists, right, in terms of what's out there, in terms of you know, research that should prove this wrong. But the downtown core was by far and away the most carbon efficient way of developing, and so that did involve, you know, densification. It did involve height, and I think it's a fascinating insight, the fact that, you know, do we consider everything when we look at, you know, tall buildings and the argument around tall buildings? Do we consider the transport? More often than not, we're not associating things with transport. So it's part of that bigger package of carbon intensity that just requires a bit more thought and consideration around how we appraise, let's say, urban development as a whole, and what is more sustainable.
It's just the often quite infuriating thing I find around net zero carbon as a term is that it's so dependent on where you draw your boundaries and what you want to take into account. And the sort of bad example I always use is that the first net zero carbon restaurant in the UK is a McDonald's drive-through outside of a small town in the Midlands beside a roundabout, and you're like, and it has a massive car park, you know.
Which area in the Midlands?
I can't remember. It's outside of town. I can't remember where it is, but I did an episode
from the
ranting
Midlands.
about
I'm
it.
from the Midlands, so I'm going to hold that one as well.
You might pass it someday.
I might pass through that one, yeah.
Driving home. But
If we get into Wolverhampton football, I swear I'm walking out.
So anyway, yes, something I've always wondered about when we're sort of coming to our net zero carbon accreditation or whatever for a building or a place. At the moment, you know, how much are we relying on offsetting to make that happen? And do you see that changing in the coming years of maybe relying on that less? I'm sure it depends so much on what project you're talking about.
It does, and my hope is that this isn't left to interpretation any longer by the net zero carbon building standard coming to fruition. I think that is the line that will be drawn upon which everyone must aspire and ultimately meet in order to say the words net zero carbon in the future. So that is what I'm going to, you know, use as my my basis for our argument there. And I think they are doing really valuable things. That the industry's out there, and I think the thing that's interesting about that standard is the fact that it's cross consensus. There is everyone you want. The key actors involved in the built environment, RIBA, UKGBC, CIBC, from different disciplines as well. It's probably the first far-reaching act of collaborative intent that I've actually seen, and it's all around this notion of what is zero carbon in the industry. They want to define it because they realise that there are certain statements and claims being made in the industry that are in effect amounting to greenwash, and it does require that standard to be in place in order to say you cannot do this, right? You cannot be saying this is zero carbon. The trained eye can critique those types of things, but the untrained eye, it's left to interpretation. So absolutely, I think it's coming. Hopefully we can, you know, have a much more meaningful conversation around zero carbon in the future. Yeah, that's my hope.
Yeah, You just feel it's a bit too amorphous at the moment.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we know the basic principles of passive design first, and getting on back onto the topic of offsets, I think the basic principle is that you want to reduce the ability to offset within a building's remit as much as possible. So that means material efficiency, looking at embodied carbon and reducing that as much as possible, looking at regenerative materials and sequestering materials as much as possible to reduce that balance even further, and then operational efficiency. How do you reduce the operational burden as much as possible as well into the future? And then offsets, by definition, should be as small as possible. Now, there's fascinating things in the market right now, because we've just seen, maybe it's days ago, the City of London saying, their carbon offset price that they're using for the GLA. If you effectively you produce a Part L submission, whatever your residual is, we'll call it, which hasn't gone over your 35%, you pay an offset price. That offset price is very low, right? So there's no financial incentive for them to actually invest in the building, in the passive design. But if you create that cost at a point where it actually becomes more viable, economically viable, to invest in the building rather than pay the offset, the building is a point of investment. So there are moves happening, I think, to prevent that thing from happening anymore, and offsets being used as the sort of, push it away, push it down the drain, push the carbon down the drain, sort of thing, out of mind, out of sight. Yeah. So I'm encouraged, let's say.
Okay, that's a really interesting one, yeah. Would love to talk a little bit about, you also work on lots of master plans around the world. How does an approach to net zero carbon change when you're looking at a wider neighborhood or city or something at the master plan level compared to one single building? Yeah,
I think that's great, and I think we have done it in steps. Kind of we've looked at and we talked about long enough. I think on the one project we did is just a incubator for ideas with getting to a net zero solution for buildings. But we actually find at district scale and at campus scale is a good starting point. So the Governor's Island project that we're doing, which is a network of buildings to become net zero. And then, UC Merced in California that we did, equally, I believe, is, the first U.S. higher ed campus is triple net zero in energy, water, and waste. And all the buildings that were built, I believe, are LEED Platinum. So, and I think it was actually built way ahead of schedule, like 3 years ahead of schedule in its commitment. So, we do find kind of a government, state, university level as a good place to start, and those principles then can probably be translated into our cities. And I know that we are currently actively working on several of those cities around the globe, and so I know we're working on a project in the U.S. where we are pushing a 600-acre brownfield site redevelopment and being able to kind of change that to meet the climate action metrics that we set forward in so many different places. So it's actually under construction as well. So we're kind of seeing that at kind of smaller city scale movements, and then also working in China, we're seeing where they've got metrics that are net zero carbon by 2050 for a 26 square kilometer new city. So, those challenges are great, but equally we are seeing those changes. So we're seeing them, tenants forcing their buildings that they're going in to be net zero. Then developers are now saying, how do we get to net zero? We're finding, the cities that we're working in, the City of London that we're here, are then putting those forces back into that, and then equally seeing where we can take that to the district or the borough level, and then seeing and rolling those out to ideally, let's say, university or a city level. Quite a few projects at the moment are doing that. They're still unique, I think, when we're looking at the campus planning and city-wide level, but they are happening quite significantly, especially a lot of the new cities you might see in China, Asia. But we're seeing things I know less about, so I don't want to get too, but I know like Ithaca in New York, where Cornell's based, they've done great initiatives. We're not part of that, but you're seeing significant changes in different cities around the world that are making those changes. And I think probably around carbon, maybe that's the way it's going to have to be. You're going to have to get these stellar moments that are going to kind of make change, and then people are going to look over their shoulder and say, hey, how do we do this? And I think I'm fine with that. I just want that to happen where people are looking over their shoulder very quickly, and we're not just waiting. As those unique projects that we remember 20 years ago, But there are actually projects where you start seeing that rolled out. I'm definitely seeing it like the tenant level of people who are demanding it from new buildings that they want to move into or adaptive reuse projects. So the ESG targets that people are trumpeting, and again, that's a long conversation in its own right, but you're actually getting everyone to be aware of that. I mean, people are actually not going to work with an employer unless they actually stand for certain rights, let alone the company itself. So, it's a talent war. So, I mean, you actually can see the ecosystem, the kind of the frenzy that people are actually working at all scales. I think the city one is more complicated, but then, I look back and, maybe taking England as an example of, suburban parts of London that were built in like 20 years. The infrastructure and everything, we can rework. We can make it more efficient. We're just choosing to find the excuses that it's hard work. But, the Victorians didn't slow down. They were hard workers, You might criticize them on many fronts, but, there are ways in which we can do this. But I think the one thing, you use Victorians in a very, summarizes everybody in England at that time. But, there is something about working all together to solve the problem, where I still feel the problem is we kind of look at building by building or parcel by parcel, site by site. We're not, maybe we get it to a district scale, but I don't know, again, the story you hear so often is that we had a district-wide cooling system, but we couldn't get everything to agree in the time frame we built the building. So there are a multitude of issues that are more complex as soon as you try to scale up.
Yeah. But just building on that point, because it's an important one, you raised the topic around net zero at this type of scale in the master plan, the city scale. And I'm a firm believer that the notion of net zero carbon is a scalable one. And it becomes easier with scale because of the diversity that you get when you look at the urban scale. So what I mean, it sounds very abstract when you think about, systems thinking, for example. But one way I often think about this is that you've got multiple different buildings of different types. They have, if I go back into engineering mode for a minute, they all have different load characteristics, let's say, and demand characteristics. So one building that's an office may require cooling at one time of the year, another requires heat, right? But the chiller plant gives off heat at that time. So what's preventing another building from simply grabbing that heat, which is free heat, right, and not taking it from a generation part, like a power plant, more often than not. So I think an ability for systems to be able to see that, and district level, campus, is perfect because you've got one ownership type. That enables it to happen because you don't get the barriers that Kent mentioned at the beginning. I think that's where we're finding the least resistance to these ideas, because you have that single source of ownership, and they can understand and leverage the benefits that come with these types of thinking. So I think campus scale has a big role to play actually in transitioning, going from the building level net zero to district scale, and realizing how these things can actually play together and be very, very harmonious. So there's so much value to be gained from it. I think just breaking down some of these cycles around ownership and access to buildings, and understanding like why is waste not being given away more frequently, because it shouldn't be a waste product. It shouldn't be, that heat shouldn't simply be going into the atmosphere. It's valuable. Just around the circular economy, it's valuable. We need to make more of it, and we need to recognize where it can be used in its immediate adjacencies. And that's where things like district heat networks, etc., can become more useful to us in the future and have a part to play, for sure. That's my net zero carbon call to arms, I'd say, at the master plan scale.
It does seem like it almost, although, as you said, it becomes much more complex as you scale up from one building to a master plan. Yeah. It also brings up those new opportunities for things like circular economy on that larger scale, sharing heat, etc. Yeah.
You see lots of evidence of things like prefabrication and modularization at that scale, where you can house facilities on site too. So if you have the scale, the economies can be realized whereby you're building, and you would have enough of an order book, let's say, in order to maintain that efficiency over scale. But we see prefabricators go out of business quite frequently at the moment. It's quite fascinating to understand the reasons for that, and understanding that will help us get to ultimately a broader circular economy solution that is fit for purpose. I don't know enough to be dangerous about why those individual companies have gone out of business, but it's telling in some regards. Like, is it because the system isn't ready for them to thrive? It's not that their solution was wrong, but are we just not ready for it? And why aren't we ready for it? That's probably the bigger question to be asked around that.
You mentioned one of the master plans you mentioned a moment ago about being zero waste and zero water as well. you tell us a little bit about that, about what that really means?
Zero waste. Zero waste is a fascinating one because it brings in this notion of circular economy. I think the one thing that I often hark on about more than anything else about the circular economy is it eliminates the concept of waste. So zero waste is massive. Waste is a verb rather than a product. And if you think in those terms about waste being something that is effectively a habit, it's habitual, if we redo that and think about the way in which we approach things, waste won't exist because we're capturing everything that we do. Now, waste in this sense is actually just saying, let's throw away less and let's recycle less and let's reuse more. That's effectively what zero waste is in this sense. But I think there's a next evolution of what waste could become in a sense, if we think more broadly about it. And then zero water is an ability to say, well, let's not just, in the same way that zero energy is effectively we're consumers, we're net consumers as a whole, this building as a whole is a net consumer. What happens if we turn it on its head a bit and we actually regenerate water and we circulate water in different ways? So that involves not just recovering water that hits our roofs or our hardscape, for example, but it's also looking at the ability to recharge the groundscape. So what I mean by that is zero irrigation. It's grey water systems, it's black water systems as well. An ability to do more on site is equally where we need to be getting now. District level, like I mentioned before, it can be more advantageous if you can group buildings together and make more use of a centralised system like that, rather than each individual building do it together. That's why I think, just to point to my point again about campus buildings being more useful in this sense, because they can actually pool their resources together and build out systems that enable zero water and zero waste to come to fruition much more quickly. And I think those lessons that they've gone through are being learnt now at other different scales that can much more viable.
I'm very excited by the prospect of that sort of thinking being applied to existing neighbourhoods and cities, because that's really where the challenge will lie.
Absolutely.
In the coming decades, with water shortages and that kind of thing. How do we navigate the complex land ownerships and policies and all that kind of thing to try and get a more sustainable use throughout our existing infrastructure?
I think that is absolutely the catch-22, isn't it? Of taking everything we know about buildings and systems from the new scale and then trying to retrofit those things, those successes that we take into the existing network that we have and trying to understand what's in the way of doing that. And what's the embodied carbon cost of retrofitting those types of systems into existing networks and existing buildings. It's the challenge to come, I think. Yeah.
We've got, that time has just flown by, but we've got sort of about 10 minutes left into the hour. Something that would be really good to get your thoughts on for the last couple of minutes is, we've talked a lot, I suppose, about your processes and your goals and the way you're trying to influence the industry. What are sort of the key innovations or the key barriers we need to see broken down over the coming years to really see this sort of scaling up at the pace that we want it to scale up to?
I want to start, and hopefully I'm not taking Kent's one on this one, but I think the ability to share ideas is something that we don't do enough in industry. And that's not just open sourcing things. There are fantastic examples about open sourcing tools, etc., for the industry. But one thing I think we have to become better at and more comfortable with is the ability to share knowledge. Right. And we've been far too sort of comfortable in this notion that we keep what is ours to ourselves. And I think one initiative that we've come up with more recently is to be able to share our expertise and our knowledge in a more sort of project facing way. So that's led to a new service in effect, by which we've talked before about the fact we're cross-disciplinary and we've got the ability to be able to critique from different angles. One thing we didn't talk about when we talked about the benefit of having structural engineers and architects in-house and interior designers and MEP engineers and landscape designers, that multidisciplinary thinking enables you to bring to the table people with different expertise at the right time, such that those things about cost, etc., can be realised much more frequently. Now, why that's advantageous to us is because it gives us that ability to think far more laterally, right? And what we've realised because of that is when we look at whole life carbon as a discipline, we've seen significant hindrances in the way that system's being applied because of various different things, not least the people that are doing it and the ability for them to exercise insight. So we think that it's very uncommon actually for an architectural practice or a multidisciplinary practice of our nature to come to the table with this type of service, but we think that's what's missing. So we've actually created a new service, Whole Life Carbon Accounting, that tries to almost advocate for a new role a new role in the process, the lead carbon designer, to act as the sort of stewardship, if you like, for whole life carbon throughout the design process moving forward, because we don't see it governed as appropriately as it should be. Now, I think that for us becomes a game changer, because it allows us to think a lot more iteratively about the carbon impacts of decision making, and allow us to kind of bring experts to the table at the right time. But it allows us to work with others. I talked about sharing knowledge. It's a service that we want to have, whether we're architects and engineers on the product or not. We can offer this service to other people so that they can benefit from effectively what we know, and we can learn from them as well. We want to be able to have that cross-pollination with different industries and different people in the industry at the same time, so that we're not keeping it all to ourselves. I think there's a lot to be gained from this process, and the role that we talked about as well is something that we want to have in the industry much more frequently. We've been advocating to the RIBA about having this lead carbon designer role, so I think it has a place in the industry. We want to be able to push it and advocate for it far more in the future.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with James on this one. I mean, I would say, we are geared up as a practice quite well. As James mentioned, we have this interdisciplinary way of bringing experts into this. But to me, it's everybody needs to change the way we've been traditionally working. And I think that requires more experts and people around the table, far more than what we can probably offer as just an interdisciplinary practice. But, if we were going to introduce timber into our buildings, and we know for the last 10 years the discussion around the insurance problems about buildings, let's get the insurers at the table. Let's get the property agents in the table. And too often we're working kind of in that same paradigm that we've worked, let's say, for the last 50 years in the way we do buildings. Great experts, but we need to also jump our sector and look out beyond it to see this. Elon Musk didn't go to Detroit to create a battery-operated car. He went to Silicon Valley. I think that immediately tells me, technology is critical to this, and understanding where the great minds are to solve these problems. So to me, that's a big, big issue. I think the problem with our industry, and this is again, like my neighbor doesn't recycle kind of moment where I don't like going down, but the issue I'm going to come back to, I think I brought up earlier, was innovation is seen as a risk in the industry. And so people are reluctant unless it's been done before. And we almost don't have the time to wait until it's been done before. We need to move quickly on solutions. We know the solutions are out there. There might be in other sectors, they could come in, or there could be actually new materials and other things that have yet to be tested on a 25-year lifespan. Now, as much as I'm promoting that, this week has gone on about schools and concrete from 25, 30 years ago, which probably had really good reasons of why that was brought to light, and probably could have been, even at some level, some embodied energy in the way it was lighter concrete and other things. But there are risks, so I can't deny that they're not there. But there's got to be a way that when we have these issues, that there are more people at that table where, these ideas don't drop on the editing room floor and don't get taken forward. We need to find a way to bring these forward. So that's a real problem. And then there's more basic ones that, I hate to tell this for people that might be listening to this podcast that aren't in the industry itself, but, we are building buildings with a building code that was written several years back. So on average, large buildings probably take 4 to 6.5 years to build, let's say. So you're building potentially a building that's like 10 years past its building code by the time you actually hand over the keys to the owners or whoever that might be. And that's a real problem. We're not able to move quickly at the speed of this industry. I mean, fashion industry can become sustainable overnight. I can wear my cactus shoes and recyclable, renewable shoes. That's a bit easier. There's not a real risk. The risk is they'll fall apart, but nothing's going to be lost. But this is a significant industry that does, and we've seen it horribly in some really bad incidents where things can go wrong, or hopefully highlighted early enough where we can actually make change to them. So I think it's really got to bring, scientists to the table, insurance agents to the table, all the people that we never thought or we would ever collaborate with in order to make the change and to get to where we need to in a very short period of time. So to me, that's kind of, I think, a call to arms of think differently, do things differently. For all the people who have said no to you, bring the person there that's saying no, or the person that that could actually unlock that to bring forward. Because I don't think we can take no continuously, because we're not going to move the needle near far enough. So to me, that's kind of the challenge and the risks. I think the municipalities and others, they're struggling to keep up with all the innovation that needs to come through, or the codes that need to be changed. And I think it's up to our practices that are putting these buildings on to kind of take more control and more responsibility of what is right or wrong.
Any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
I think hope is on the horizon. There for every example of a barrier, we can point to one of an opportunity happening. And I only have to look as far as LETI, that I think about the Low Energy Transformation Initiative, and the fact that they're effectively formed from a group of people that had discontent around the industry and wanted to create that change. And that's a fascinating story that I've been fortunate enough to be part of for some time. And that ability for them to keep advocating for change at a faster pace, and I think what they're getting the ear of government, that has so much value there. And I only have to look just back at the building regulations point you made earlier, Kent, the fact that when government put out the Part L consultation in 2021, when you compare that consultation response rate from the 2012, I think it was the 2012, the last edition, they had a couple of hundred in the 2012 edition. It was into the tens of thousands in the 2021, and government weren't geared up to cope with that level of response. So it just goes to show, that people are pushing back, society is pushing back on that whole notion that it's not good enough anymore, and it's happening at the grassroots level. They're helping to feed this notion that the government have to push harder, they have to go further, they have to go faster, and keeping pace with the market. That's the big question here. Is regulation simply to pull up the floor, or is it also to indicate what the ceiling here is, the potential? And for regulation to play two roles in effect, I think that has to be the case to enable people to go further and faster, and for those leading lights to be able to put that marker out there in a way that's not preventative to them from an economic sense. In order to do that, they have to see where the advantages lie for them as well.
Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a fantastic conversation. I wish I could talk your ear off all day, or have you talk my ear off all day.
Thanks for having us.
And yeah, we'll wrap it up there, I guess.
Yeah, well, thank you.